Jessica Wallace is an associate professor of history at Georgia College and State University. She earned her BA in history and literature at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and her MA and PhD in history from The Ohio State University. She teaches courses and conducts research in colonial America, Native American history, and digital humanities. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Jessica Wallace to the Georgia Archives.
Thank you, Hendry. Thank you all for being here this morning. As Hendry noted, we're going to be talking a lot about women today. So hope by the end of the day, you're convinced that Native American women not only existed, right, but are also incredibly prominent in the history of this time period, even if they don't necessarily show up quite as strongly in the archives as the men do. So I'll be focusing on a very particular episode of Native American women's involvement in colonial America and looking at the ways that Cherokee women interacted with colonial forts during the 7 Years' War, so 1750s and 60s. During that time period, we're going to see the alliance between the Cherokees and British colonists break down as trade abuses, land encroachments, and broken treaty promises combined to embitter Cherokees against especially the colony of South Carolina. There was a lot of skirmishes and small-scale attacks that grew into larger conflicts that would engulf the region from 1759 to 61, resulting in military and territorial loss for Cherokees. So while most accounts of this Anglo-Cherokee War tend to focus on the causes of the war, its male combatants, Cherokee women held a lot of power during this time period. They played a lot of overlooked but significant roles, especially at backcountry forts, where colonial traders, so I always feel I have to clarify this, traders with a D, not traders like, Benedict Arnold type, but people who conduct trade. Colonial traders and colonists lived next to Cherokee villages. So much of the documentary evidence that we have for sustained relationships and interactions between colonists, soldiers, traders, and Cherokee men and women come from reports from these colonial forts in Cherokee country. So Fort Prince George is going to be kind of that blue dot in the middle of the map. It's in today's upstate South Carolina. And that's going to be near the lower Cherokee town of Keowee. Towards the upper end of that kind of trail of dots is Fort Loudon. So Loudon here, Prince George here, that's Charleston for some reference. So these two forts are going to be constructed in the 1750s and serve as the basis for a lot of the documentary evidence we have for what Cherokee women were doing during this time period. So hundreds of miles from Charleston, these forts offered a unique opportunity for colonists and Cherokees to regularly interact with each other, and they especially afforded opportunities for Cherokee women to exert their own influence over their colonial neighbors, primarily through their control of local food supplies. Cherokee women also served as part-time translators and sources of intelligence during the 1750s and 60s in the 7 Years' War, and branched out into new powerful positions that left colonial men finding themselves reliant upon women's experience and knowledge. So as the 7 Years' War began, British colonists turned to Cherokees for military assistance in campaigns against the French. Pretty familiar story to us. Overhill Cherokee headmen. So overhills are going to be those folks living in the highest parts of the Appalachian Mountains, so near Fort Loudon. Overhill Cherokee headmen would turn this perceived vulnerability into leverage. They argued that they needed forts staffed by the British in their own territories to provide protection for their women and children while Cherokee men were away. So if colonial men wanted Cherokee assistance, they would have to offer some sort of physical protection to the women and children they would be leaving behind as warriors. Negotiations with Virginia to build a fort in Overhill territory would also emphasize the necessity of like military power in the region to ward off attacks by Shawnees, Delawares, and other French allied groups in the region, who would seek to, quote, murder in the most inhuman manner defenseless husbandmen at their labor and weak women in their beds with their tender infants at their breasts. Cherokees and British alike would assume that they shared the same ideas, right, about the role of men as protectors of women and children. So they used this argument that appealed to the common gender role, that provided them this mutually acceptable method for approaching what could have been a sticky diplomatic issue. It allowed each side to put the construction of the forts in the best possible light, while maybe masking some other more self-serving motives. So if we look at Fort Prince George, this was built slightly earlier in 1753. You can't visit the site today. It was flooded in the 70s, and it now is under South Carolina's Lake Keowee, named after the nearby Cherokee town. And this is in Lower Cherokee territory. So unfortunately for us, the commanders at Fort Prince George did not keep especially frequent or detailed records, especially in comparison to Fort Loudon. So it's a little trickier to piece together kind of daily life at the fort, the interactions between the garrison and neighboring Cherokees at Keowee, because we don't have quite the same robust documentary records. Fort Prince George's garrison did attempt to grow its own food. So they did rely a little bit on corn and other foodstuffs brought in from nearby Cherokee villages to supplement what they were able to grow on their own. We do know that there was a small number of women and children living in the fort. A list of smallpox victims from January 1760 included the names of one woman and one child. We're not sure of their backgrounds, whether they were white or Cherokee. There were multiple accusations, tragically, at the fort of sexual assault of soldiers, and especially the garrison's commander, Lieutenant Richard Coitmore, of taking sexual advantage of Cherokee women, often when their husbands were away. So obviously, this is occurring in the midst of frontier raids, murders, a lot of heightened tension during the 7 Years' War. That sort of behavior is not going to make interactions between Fort Prince George and nearby towns any easier. Kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, in Fort Loudon, which is in today's eastern Tennessee, we have a lot more documentary evidence from commanders Raymond and Paul Desmarais. They were brothers, and their officers. They keep really detailed records. They write dozens of letters to colonial officials. So we have a much more robust look at what was actually going on at this more western Cherokee fort. So Fort Loudon was built in 1756. Its site was also flooded in the 1970s. So it is under a reservoir in eastern Tennessee today. But in contrast to Fort Prince George, the University of Tennessee actually did a lot of archaeological excavation before the TVA flooded the site. So there's a state park in Tennessee today that is a reconstruction of Fort Loudon, slightly different site from its original position, but it gives a really good recreation of the fort. They used a combination of the archaeology and the documentary record to reconstruct it as accurately as they could. And the state does a really nice job of working with volunteers who come in a few weekends a year and do garrison weekends. So, you know, if you've ever been to a Civil War reenactment, there's some folks who are like super hardcore and some folks who are there to have a good time. The people who reenact a 7 Years' War tend to be really hardcore and like really invested in the history, and they've read almost as much in the primary source material as historians have. So they give a really nice garrison weekend. I highly recommend it if you ever find yourself in eastern Tennessee. So this particular site, like I said, way better documentary records. It's going to be constructed near a few different Cherokee towns. Tomotley and Tuskegee are going to be closest. At the time of the fort's end in 1760, we know that there's over 60 women and children living inside the fort. So a much larger presence of both colonial and Cherokee women at this fort. There's about 100 men there at the same time. So far from being like, a gathering of single men, we have a lot of family activity going on in this particular area. A lot of these women are going to be colonial camp followers and wives who contribute to the fort's daily labor of like tending gardens, cooking, laundry, and nursing. We also know that Cherokee women are going to be performing a similar thing. Yes. They're going to be performing similar labor. So the tending the gardens, the laundry, the cooking. They also take on some really unique roles. One unnamed woman is going to be selling illegal alcohol to nearby Cherokees. So we have some participation in the black market, shall we say. Another unnamed woman is going to be functioning as the fort's food purchaser. So given the dynamics of purchasing corn from neighboring Cherokee women, this woman was almost certainly herself Cherokee and quite likely to be the daughter of a British trader. So we know of people who have one European father, typically, and a Native American mother, often end up in these in-between positions where they're able to use their language and cultural heritage to foster relationships between two very different groups. And this woman who's purchasing corn for the fort's use would have fit into that sort of in-between facilitator of trade really nicely. Unfortunately, her name is never mentioned in the documentary record. It's also unclear how she gained her position, how she rose to the attention of British officials. She might have been married to a trader or a soldier. She may have been the same woman named Nancy, who several years before purchased corn at Raymond Demaray's request. So we do have the name of one woman who served in this role. This particular individual was also trusted enough to be sent to Charleston. It's about a 500-mile journey for supplies and messages. So in May 1759, Commander Demaray is worried enough about supply chain issues that he informs South Carolina's governor that he's uncertain when he's going to be getting restocked supplies from Charleston. So instead, he's going to send what he calls the woman who has the care of the store to buy some supplies that are needed for the fort. He also sends with her a, quote, nest of Indian baskets and a beaver skin as presents, which he begged the governor to accept. So this woman is not only accumulating foodstuffs and buying food for daily life at the fort, but she's also facilitating trade and diplomacy by bringing supplies from Fort Loudon, including women's baskets, which are a valuable commodity, and a diplomatic present to the governor. We do know, in addition to this food purchaser, at least several more Cherokee women served as part-time interpreters for the fort, which is a highly practical decision. Both forts, Prince George and Loudon, really struggled with securing and paying for full-time colonial interpreters, despite that position being a pretty crucial one for facilitating communication between groups. So in March 1758, for instance, Demaray questioned whether he should provide provisions to what he called the woman linguister at the fort. There is a short-term Presbyterian missionary living at the fort as well, William Richardson. He also finds himself reliant upon the translation services of Cherokee women, which feeds his frustration that, he believes there are some Indians who could speak English but refused to do so. Richardson's complaint about unwilling English-speaking Cherokees unwittingly revealed that more than a handful of Cherokees, both male and female, did speak English in the 1750s and 60s, at least enough of it, right, to be a passable translator. So Richardson lives in nearby Chota, which is kind of the principal village of the Overhill region. But he has a lot of connections with the fort, right, as the only other colonial person kind of living and operating in the fort besides those traders and those soldiers. So he likely got his recommendations for which women to rely on as translators from Fort Loudoun's garrison. He worked closely with those colonists at the fort. He relied on their judgment in many of his interactions with Cherokee leaders, kind of relying on the judgment of the commander to tell him, you know, which Cherokee men might be interested in converting to Christianity and which were going to just be pulling his leg. When forts found themselves lacking then in like qualified male translators, they're forced to employ female ones, which gave Cherokee women both a temporary income source, but also a lot of power over trade talks, religious discussions, and sharing of military intelligence. So it's a very temporary part-term job for these women, but it's one that is giving them quite crucial position in this often very tense relationship with British colonists. So we are looking at period of warfare, right? So intelligence gathering is going to be one way that we see Cherokee women appearing in documents. Military alliance intelligence gathering are very prominent pieces of the relationship between British soldiers and Native Americans during the 1750s and 60s. While we definitely see more examples of male intelligence gathering showing up in the documents, both forts did receive intelligence from female sources as well. So for instance, in July 1759, a Cherokee woman who had formerly had a white husband informed Fort Prince George of Upper Creek and Overhill Cherokee plots to capture Fort Loudoun and similarly to attack and capture Fort Prince George. Fort Prince George's commander doesn't really believe her at first. He thinks that she seemed, quote, a little in liquor, but she delivered the same story verbatim the next day, begging him through tears to never tell another soul lest she be killed for divulging this top secret plot. The commander, Coitmore, believed her tale when it was basically confirmed through a young male spy who had seen Four Creeks entering into lower Cherokee towns and spreading rumors of impending attacks against British outposts. Several months later, shortly before there was a Cherokee attack upon Fort Prince George, one of the second in command officers, Alexander Milne, noted that a Cherokee woman had told the fort soldiers that white scalps had been brought to the nearby sugar town amidst great rejoicing, and that trader Cornelius Ducharte's partner related that Cherokees near Hiwassee had captured two white men and forced them to engage on the warpath. So we're seeing rumors or bits of intelligence being spread by Cherokee women to soldiers at the fort. Another potential opportunity for intelligence transmission at Fort Prince George was cut short immediately before that fort was attacked in 1760 by Overhill's, intent on freeing their kinsmen who were held hostage inside the fort. Alexander Milne, that second in command, noted that on February 16th, two women appeared on the Kiowa side of the riverbank across from the fort around 8 a.m. And Cornelius Ducharte, whose wife was Cherokee and who had relayed some information previously, he approached the fort side of the river to kind of see if he could talk to them and gather any information. Their conversation was cut short when an Overhill Cherokee named Aconostota appeared with a bridle, claiming he's chasing his horse, and he wants to go down to Charleston, meet with the governor, and he requests a meeting with the fort's commander to help facilitate his travel to Charleston. This is a ruse. Oconostota's men open fire as soon as Fort Prince George's commander appears. Courtmere is killed in the crossfire, and all the Cherokee hostages within Fort Prince George are executed in the midst of this attack by the Cherokee. So in his account of the aftermath, Milne is far more concerned with like justifying his actions. Hey, here's why I killed a bunch of hostages. Please don't like put me on trial for that. And kind of defending what had happened in the attack than he is in noting like, hey, what became of those women who were across the river right before this attack occurred? So unfortunately, we don't know what happened to them. Fort Loudon is going to similarly have some instances of women passing on military intelligence. We actually know a few of their names this time. At the end of August 1759, Paul Desmarais convinced a woman named Buffalo Skin to pass along intelligence that she had gathered on a recent trip to a French fort. She did so reluctantly, only after she received promises of presents. Right, so in her case, we seem to be seeing a tactic to receive compensation for her knowledge instead of just giving it away for free, like we see at Fort Prince George. She was given 2 kegs of liquor and afterwards then reported a meeting between disgruntled Cherokee men and French agents, but she didn't offer any information about like future attacks on British outposts. So while it's impossible to evaluate the truth of these accounts or even the motivation behind them, the fact that both forts commanders are seeking out information from female sources suggests they did recognize women as a useful fount of intelligence. And for their part, by extracting payment for their information, at least some of the time, Cherokee women tried to operate on a similar level as the men, who were also paid for their military intelligence, though we rarely see men having to ask for it. They're usually asked for more payment than is offered, but there seems to be this understanding that male sources of intelligence are, of course, going to be compensated. Women typically don't get money unless they push for it, as Buffalo Skin did. So perhaps these forts commanders assume, hey, women don't require compensation because many of these women were in relationships with male garrisons or with nearby traders. Many soldiers and traders in the 1700s married or had common law unions with Cherokee women or cohabitated with them. We're not entirely sure of the exact legal status of these relationships, though in the documents, these women are referred to as wives. So it makes it a little tricky to tease out how formalized those unions were. Traders Robert Gowdy and James Beamer both had Cherokee wives and at least 3 children apiece. One of those children, Thomas Beamer, later became a trader and interpreter in his own right. John Stewart, an officer at Fort Loudon and later Indian superintendent for the South, had a Cherokee wife and several children as well. And so did another unknown number of soldiers at Fort Loudon. Unfortunately, the names of these women and children are largely unrecorded. So from a Cherokee perspective, women often supplied sex to visiting dignitaries. It's a custom that worked with other practices of hospitality, right, to create and solidify bonds between villagers and outsiders. So it's possible some of these relationships start as simply welcoming people to the region, but they continue far beyond what is just hey, welcome to town types of opening overtures. At Fort Loudon, these Cherokee women, these wives and children, typically don't live in the fort. They typically stay in nearby villages like Tomotley or Tuskegee or Chota, but they visit their husbands quite frequently and sometimes even side with them in disputes with Cherokee leaders. In at least one really interesting episode, these relationships actually spare a colonial soldier from punishment for desertion. So summer 1758, Samuel Gerard, he's a soldier from Fort Prince George, abandoned his post and came in the night to his house at Toka. Desmarais hears about this and is like, hey, this AWOL soldier is in our territory. He intends to send men from Fort Loudon to go to Gerard's Cherokee wife's house and to capture him and return him to Fort Prince George for punishment for his crime of desertion. However, an Overhill headman named Willinawa intervened. He told Desmarais that Gerard had lived among Cherokees for several years, and he has, quote, has had some of our women and has got children by them. He's our relation and shan't be taken up. So Willinawa then advised Desmarais to take the matter up with other headmen, get their opinion, and Gerard seemingly avoids any sort of recapture and punishment for desertion. Willinawa's emphasis on the relationship between Gerard and his female companions and his resulting Cherokee kin saved him. And it also underscores the importance of these Cherokee kinship ties. Right? You're connected into powerful families in the region, and the British simply decide to kind of leave this guy alone instead of offending his families by trying to capture him. The area where we see Cherokee women displaying perhaps the most power in their relationships with forts, though, is in this role as primary suppliers of food for both garrisons. So Fort Prince George did raise some of their own food. Fort Loudon never grew more than a small garden. Cherokee women traded corn, fowl, other foodstuffs, which became incredibly important exchanges between the fort and nearby towns. The lively trade of goods caused Desmarais to compare Fort Loudon to a marketplace more than a military establishment, as Cherokee women bartered food and other goods like clay pots. We know from archaeological excavation that were very few European-made dishes within Fort Loudon, and the vast majority of artifacts discovered in the excavations of the fort were actually broken Cherokee pottery. So a ton of locally made items were coming into that fort and making it possible for people to carry on basic tasks like cooking food. As farmers in 18th century Cherokee villages, women controlled access to corn and other crops. Cherokee community values stipulated hospitality, offering gifts of food to visitors and the needy, which really describes Fort Loudon quite well. Its commanders write multiple times to the governor saying that they need more cattle or they're low on food stores. So the fort is highly dependent upon the charity and the business savvy of their neighboring Cherokee women when it comes to getting enough food to sustain the fort. The crucial importance of the women's corn crop to both Cherokee and colonial stomachs was made really clear on several occasions when the fort's men were called upon to aid the women. So during a period of pervasive illness among Overhill Cherokees, one headman called for help among the fort. He wants them to come and basically tend the corn crop to make sure that while the Cherokee are recovering from their illness, that animals don't just eat all the crop and destroy the entire harvest. So while Cherokee women are primarily responsible for agriculture, Cherokee men would help clear fields, would help plant crops. So asking the fort to help in these vital tasks suggested soldiers are viewed as an extension of this existing labor pool. And as allies, they're bound to help their neighbors in a time of illness. On a more regular basis, we see from colonial records that during the growing season, one of the jobs assigned to Fort Loudon soldiers was guarding Native American women's cornfields to keep horses out from both the fort and nearby villages. So while the soldiers are clearly benefiting from having a more stable food source, women are also benefiting from the soldiers' labor in this exchange. And the arrangement is also putting women in this really unique position where, at least for a few hours at a time, they get to boss the men around, right? They get to tell these colonial soldiers where to go and what to do in keeping animals out of their cornfields. So periodically, we do see corn being given to colonial neighbors, but most of the time we're seeing an exchange and like the sale of corn. This is not just a charity thing. Corn formed the bulk of women's trade, with Fort Loudoun in particular. The fort's reliance on purchasing food from neighboring women gave Cherokee women plenty of an economic incentive to discourage the fort soldiers from planting their own corn crops, right? They would lose a lot of income if the soldiers ever were able to successfully raise a crop of their own. So while corn was the largest trade item on a local level, we also see women making money as suppliers of a bunch of other plants. Indian pinkroot was used to treat worm fevers in colonial children. Ginseng and Virginia snakeroot are also frequently brought to trading posts and forts and then shipped to colonial centers further east. So these other plants are largely overlooked when assessing the Indian trade, but they seem to have been traded even more extensively than the foodstuffs like corn. So if we're looking at trade beyond just the immediate local level, things like ginseng and snakeroot are going to be far more prominent than corn. But on a local level, corn is where it's at. Cherokee women also have this small but thriving trade in double weave baskets. You can see an image of one there. These are really elaborately made items where one basket is woven inside the other, and the two are going to share a common rim. And the end product is a really strong, flexible, very durable basket. At home, baskets are used for everyday use, like gathering, processing, serving, storing food. They're also used in ceremonies. But in the colonial trade, baskets are used for practical purposes, but also are popular as like these exotic artifacts of Native American culture. So women are providing a lot of goods that are being purchased by men. They're also shaping the goods that Cherokees are consuming. So women drove the majority of the demand for cloth in the Indian trade, which by volume was the largest component of items traded to Native Americans in the Southeast. Things like wool binding, garters, silk ribbon, beads are also sought after trade goods, as were tools like hoes, tin pots, sewing supplies, razors, and knives. At conferences with Southeastern Native Americans, colonial officials specifically referenced items like calico, scissors, needles, and gartering as gifts brought for the women who attended these conferences. Likewise, an Overhill leader named Attakullakulla once ended a letter to the governor with a request that the governor send his wife a new cloak. So women are vocalizing what items they would like to see and purchase from colonial traders in exchange for not just furs and deer skins, but also for the plants and commodities that women could produce as well. After the Anglo-Cherokee War broke out in 1759, and hostilities between British colonists in the Carolinas and Georgia heightened with the Cherokees, Cherokee women became even more crucial players in deciding Fort Loudoun's fate. Again, they're about 500 miles from Charleston, very isolated if Cherokees decide to cut the fort off from their supply lines, which does happen in the spring and summer of 1760. Many Overhill Cherokee men decide to basically besiege the fort and attempt to starve them out. The fort lasts as long as it does in this besiegement because women are bringing food in, and pretty open defiance of the pro-war policies of their leaders to try to starve the garrison. So these women are bringing food to their partners in the fort. Other women are selling food in exchange for ribbons and paint, so proving that we still have some trade going on even in the midst of a war. These actions, like I said, directly interfere with the intentions of pro-war Cherokees to starve out the garrison. So Overhill leader Willie Nawa, who several years earlier had been the one to defend the colonial soldier Samuel Jaron, the AWOL guy, he threatens in this instance to kill anyone who assisted Fort Loudoun's garrison, who fed them. The women simply laugh at him at this point, saying, you know, if you were so foolish as to kill us, our own relations would avenge our deaths. So again, we're seeing the importance of kinship connections and networks within Cherokee communities here. Willie Nawa does not end up killing any women who offer food and other assistance to Fort Loudoun. Willie Nawa's brother, the Overhill headman Adekalakulla, even temporarily moves into the fort with his family and encouraged the women's relief efforts. So we're definitely seeing a lot of individual variation on whether to ally with the fort and continue to offer it military and economic support, or to try to force the fort into surrender. Because these women are controlling the production of food, they had the right to decide how they wanted to distribute it. As historian Michelle Lemaster put it, the irony, probably lost on the British garrison, lay in the fact that the fort, supposedly built for the protection of Indian women and children, depended in its final days on the provisions provided by those very women. So by never securing their own internal food sources, the fort was ultimately dependent on the charity of Cherokee women to survive. And during a siege by pro-Cherokee forces, pro-war Cherokee forces, pardon me, through the summer of 1760, that dependence is really going to be shown in a very dire way. By late summer, the women either stopped coming or simply ran out of spare food. The war had put a severe strain on Cherokee food sources, so we're not entirely sure from the surviving records whether the women eventually stopped as a military strategy or if it was a simple survival mechanism. They didn't have enough food to continue sharing. By the time Fort Loudoun did surrender in August 1760, the garrison was reduced to eating their horses and had simply run out of other food sources. After the surrender, the garrison marched towards Fort Prince George under Cherokee escort. The next day, 700 Cherokees attacked, and roughly 24 members of Fort Loudoun's garrison, including 3 colonial women, were killed in retaliation for the deaths of Cherokee hostages at Fort Prince George earlier in the year. The remaining about 150 members of the garrison were held as prisoners during the following months of the war, and Cherokee families moved into Fort Loudoun for the next 11 months. After that, the fort seems to have been abandoned. A British soldier who toured the region in 1762 remarked that he saw Fort Loudoun in a pretty serious state of disrepair, suggesting that no one had lived in it for at least 6 months. Fort Prince George came near similar destruction in fall of 1760, as it was surrounded, also low on food, though likewise supplemented by Cherokee women who smuggled food in. The Fort Prince George crisis was averted when there was an arrival of more supplies from Charleston and also 500 soldiers as reinforcement. So, while the history of these colonial forts tends to focus on their majority male populations and then how men interacted with male Cherokee neighbors, we do see women playing pretty significant roles in the survival of these garrisons. So despite the fact that there's almost a complete silence on the names of any Cherokee women connected with these forts, we do see hints in the records of the ways that their actions and decisions kept these forts operating well, if not like surviving at all. Cherokee women traded baskets, served as the primary consumers of many British goods, particularly the textiles and cooking utensils. They were also very active in marketing their goods and foods to traders and soldiers who often did not grow their own crops, like we've seen. This control over the local food supply gave women a great deal of power in their relationships with colonial garrisons. When women withdrew that support, as in the case of Fort Loudoun, when these women stopped bringing food, forts simply could not sustain themselves. So the presence of these colonial forts also afforded Cherokee women some opportunities to serve as part-time translators and gave them an expanded pool of not just economic partners, but also potential sexual and romantic partners. So far from being colonial-dominated spaces or even male-dominated spaces, colonial forts ended up giving Cherokee women opportunities to branch out into new powerful positions that often left colonial men finding themselves reliant upon Cherokee women's knowledge and experience. So I thank you for coming this morning and listening to my fascination with the ways that Cherokees and colonists would interact with each other in the middle of the 1800s. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to talk about that. Yes.
Can you talk some about your sources?
Yeah.
Are these out of Colonial Office 5 records? Where did you find?
That's a great question. So a lot of these records are actually housed in Michigan right now, which is odd. So the Clements Library at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor has a lot of records of South Carolina governors, oddly enough. So the governor during most of this time period, his papers are up there. It's the William Littleton collection. There's also a lot of documents of British military figures. So Jeffrey Amherst, some of his records are there as well. So I used a lot of like governor's papers for this. There's also a lot of records at the South Carolina archives. So those, let's see, the House of Commons, their records are largely published, which is terrific. The upper house of the Colonial Assembly, most of their records are still in manuscript. So some of those records contain like letters from the fort's commanders to colonial officials. They also include minutes of conversations that happened when Cherokee leaders would travel to Charleston. So those were really helpful. There's also two published volumes actually called Documents Relating to Indian Affairs in South Carolina. And those cover most of the 1750s and kind of through the mid 1760s. And those will include a lot of letters talking about Native Americans. So a lot from like Fort Loudoun to the governor, for instance, will be in there. And there was some stuff in the South Carolina Gazette, the colonial newspaper. So the bulk of my records do come from South Carolina. They were the most active in this war. North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia also contributed some records, but for the most part, it's from South Carolina and mostly political and military records. So, but a good portion of them have been published, which is very handy, especially for those of us who don't want to go to Michigan in the winter. It's very handy.
You were talking earlier about things that were traded. And one time when I was out walking, I found a pipe. It was a clay pipe.
Mhm.
And I took it to Emory to the archaeological department, and they told me it's a trading pipe.
Mhm.
I was wondering if you've ever seen one like it.
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with the pipes as some of the other artifacts. But I do know that many groups use pipes for some for everyday use, some for like ceremonial use. And we do see, especially in, what's the word I'm looking for, especially in like diplomatic meetings between colonists and Native Americans, pipes could feature pretty prominently. But I have not actually done a ton of research into like the role of pipes in these trades. I'll have to look into that. I brought a pen so I could make notes on things to look into. So, thank you for that. Yeah, Henry. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Wondered about the relationship between these Cherokee women and the traders, because when I read about Cherokee women, it seems to me like they had a lot more power than European women in a lot of ways. They could end marriages. They decided which prisoners lived and which were executed. I've really wondered how in the world they negotiated these relationships.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. And I mean, the records talk about these women as wives, but we're really not sure like how long-term some of these relationships were. And it's, like you point out, right, they can essentially divorce far easier than the British could. And I mean, from a practical standpoint, it kind of makes sense that you wouldn't legalize a marriage and kind of take divorce off the table, at least for your British husband, right? So I think with like Samuel Jaron, right, we know with him that he had several partners, which would suggest that these women are definitely having a lot of power in their relationships with him. Like they can come and go as they please. He can come and go as he pleases, apparently, too. So getting my train of thought back. Go ahead.
Allegiance was really with their mother's mind, not the husband.
Right.
Expect them necessarily to move.
Right. And thank you. That was where I wanted to go with that. So yeah, like these children that come out of these relationships, like there's no concept of like, oh, part Indian, right? Like we sometimes have today. It's like these children are fully Cherokee because their mama is a member of the tribe. So they have clan identities, they have relatives, and in a lot of ways, your maternal uncles are far more important to your upbringing than your dad is, right? So while British men are expecting like ownership almost over their children, they are finding that they have to negotiate with their Cherokee kin in figuring out like, hey, how much say do I have over my kids' upbringing? So it is this really interesting, I don't want to say a power struggle, but this interesting negotiation, right? That happens on very personal levels when it comes to negotiating a relationship that, I mean, both sides have models for how marriage works, but these models don't always line up. They're very different, right? And so we do get very small, interesting glimpses of how like women are bringing their assumptions about marriage into their relationships with British men and making British men kind of adapt in how they think about partnerships. It's not quite as prominent in records for the British as it is for the French, but I do know that there are some French men who have like multiple families. So some are like French back in like Quebec, and then some are Native American out in the country. So if you're not legally marrying, that remains a possibility open to you as well, to have multiple families whose paths probably never cross. So yeah, there's a lot that we don't have documentary evidence for, which would be fascinating to know more about how these families actually tick on the micro level. Yes.
I was in the 2nd South Carolina Regiment Continental Line for 5 years, and we would go all over South Carolina for events. And we also did some of the French and Indian War and even Bloody Marsh.
Okay.
So that we didn't just stay in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah. So you went.
So we would go to several events, and we went to Fort Loudon for at least 2 events. That I remember.
It's a really fun weekend because, I mean, the amount of research that y'all pour into making these events and people come alive is really, really fantastic. And I know some of the folks I've talked to at Fort Loudon, there are like young adults who've been doing this since they were like 2 or 3. Their like parents dragged them out to these events every weekend. And as adults, they still want to do it, which is amazing. And we were talking before we started, and I'd mentioned like one of the things I love to do with my students is get them to think about historical people as like actual human beings who like, you know, eat food and say curse words and like do regular human being things instead of like, oh, they're just a bunch of old names and stuff. And so I think events like that are really helpful for kind of driving home to the people who come to them. Hey, you know, what does it feel like to walk 20 miles a day, like for days on end? How do your feet feel after that? Like, what's it really like to cook food over a campfire? What are the skills that go into these basic chores that we tend not to talk about in history books, but that kind of occupied the majority of people's lives in the past?
I went on the Over Mountain Victory Trail, which is over 200 miles. We did about 150 of it. And I was doing that in moccasins. And I paid for it with my feet
I believe
for a long time. It was like over a year before my feet recovered from that.
Yeah, our modern feet are not up to this, right?
But anyway, Fort Loudon is a fantastic situation. It's a wonderful place to go. If you're going anywhere through Tennessee, try to go by and
it's
see it
lovely.
because it's really, really a great fort.
It really
Great
is.
bookstore too.
Yeah, they have a really nice visitor center where they highlight a lot of the primary documents and a lot of the archaeology that went into like putting the fort back together. So they do a fantastic job up there trying to educate folks.
Now, was the original site of the fort in what is now the lake?
It is. Yeah, and the town sites of Tuskegee and Tomotley are there as well. So just outside the reconstructed fort, they do have 2 reconstructed Cherokee homes. So one is showing like a summer house, which is very open and airy, and the other is a clay walled winter house. And on at least some of the garrison weekends, they also have descendants of Cherokee people from the East coming in and doing demonstrations of like, hey, what would Cherokee life have been like in the 1750s and 60s? That's a much smaller group. And they can't always get out there. A lot of them come from Oklahoma. But that adds a really good balance to like the British reenactment stuff. Having those Cherokee reenactors too is really, really useful. So it's always a great time when they're able to join.
Now, do they have a good turnout of French soldiers?
Not on the 2 occasions that I've gone. They didn't have any. No, the French never actually attacked Fort Loudon. They always talked. The British were always like, oh my gosh, they're right around the next river. They're coming. They're just on the mountain behind us. They even bring cannons into Fort Loudon to try to defend the fort against French attack, but it never comes. So the French, there's rumors, there's some evidence of like isolated individuals coming into the region, but not an actual like regiment or anything like that. Henry.
The story you told about the Cherokee woman who sort of warned the garrison and was disbelieved, it's sort of a theme that we see a lot in sort of, you know, conflict with Native Americans, like the leader of Fort Mims didn't believe in a slave person. At the beginning of the Seminole War, a general said he placed no faith in Indian promises type of thing. So I'm curious if you've seen any of the flip in your research where someone provided information and, you know, the colonial garrison sort of accepted it and said, oh, we need to prepare, or if it's always sort of distrust or they're just looking for money. They're just, you know, trying to get paid for intelligence type of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of the prominent Cherokee men in the region are given the benefit of the doubt, at least during time of war. Like during time of peace, it's a little trickier. But like Attaculla, for instance, he's the guy who asks the governor to send his wife a new coat. He moves into the fort. He has a pretty tight relationship with the garrison in the later part of the 1750s. Very much mistrusted in the early part of the 1750s. But he's kind of gotten himself into the good graces of the commanders there, and they tend to believe him more often than not. Every so often you'll get a letter saying like, yeah, this story sounds kind of sketchy, or like, maybe he's trying to play us here. But he goes on a few different kind of scouting expeditions a little further west and comes back with like some French scalps and intelligence of like, hey, they're trying to build a fort over here. Here's where we've noticed French activity in the region. And that intelligence most often is taken verbatim, and the only argument is over how much compensation he should be getting. So like the commander of Fort Loudon wants to pay just the individual men who actually killed and scalped the French. And Attaculla is arguing, no, all 30 of us should be given compensation for scalping. So we tend to see more arguments over how much is this worth than over is it trustworthy or not. Now, like I said, kind of outside of war times, yeah, there is a lot more concern over the trustworthiness of intelligence, and especially like, is it trustworthy enough to actually pay for it? But when the garrison's already on high alert, they tend to take any information as, okay, we have to treat it as true. And then if it ends up being not okay, but we have to prepare like for the worst. So I would say that the threat of attack is kind of the major factor that they're weighing at this point, and anything they can do to prevent being caught by surprise is worth it. But yeah, and especially I know there's a great example of like Andrew Montour, who's a interpreter and intermediary in Pennsylvania. His intelligence is always being doubted because like this woman in the story, he also likes his alcohol. So people are always saying like, oh, he's just a drunk, and like not trusting him. And that ends very tragically in several cases where the people who ignored his warnings were actually ambushed and killed. So yeah, but this unwillingness to trust Native American intelligence does seem to be a very common thread throughout Native American history. I think that we're at the end of my slot here, so I'll turn it back over to Hendry. Thank you all again so much.